Some packages are never meant to be delivered. Some secrets hide in plain sight, wrapped in brown paper and addressed to people who don't exist, and some mailmen notice patterns that intelligence agencies miss until it's too late. Spring of 1962 brought more than cherry blossoms to Chicago's North Side neighborhoods, where brick apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder along streets that had housed waves of immigrants for generations, and now witnessed a different kind of infiltration that federal authorities would not fully understand for another 18 months. The Cold War had transformed ordinary American life into a landscape of suspicion, where neighbors reported neighbors, where schoolchildren practiced nuclear attack drills by hiding under wooden desks that would offer no protection against Soviet missiles, and where the failed Bay of Pigs invasion just 1 year earlier had intensified the paranoia that communist agents walked freely among loyal citizens. Walter Henderson had carried mail through these same 6 blocks for 17 years, ever since returning from occupied Japan, where he had served as a logistics coordinator during the final months of World War II, and his military training had taught him to recognize patterns in seemingly random data, even when his supervisors at the Chicago Central Post Office dismissed his observations as the paranoid delusions of a man who read too many spy novels. The route that Walter walked 6 days a week covered exactly 423 addresses, distributed across residential buildings that ranged from elegant brownstones built during the 1890s to hastily constructed apartment complexes that landlords had thrown up during the housing shortage after the war. He knew which tenants collected disability checks on the 3rd of every month, which ones received care packages from relatives in Poland or Germany, and which apartments had remained mysteriously vacant for months despite the chronic housing shortage that kept waiting lists at every building in the neighborhood. His leather mail satchel carried the weight of other people's lives in the form of letters, bills, magazines, and the occasional package that required a signature, and over 17 years he had developed an almost photographic memory for addresses and delivery patterns that allowed him to sort his route mentally before he even left the post office each morning. What troubled him during the spring of 1962 was the increasing number of packages addressed to apartments that postal records indicated were vacant, packages that arrived with return addresses from scientific supply companies, electronics distributors, and import businesses that Walter's cursory research at the public library suggested didn't actually exist at the addresses printed on their labels. The first package that truly caught his attention arrived on March 14th during a late winter snowstorm that had reduced visibility to less than 20 feet and turned the sidewalks into treacherous ice fields where elderly residents rarely ventured outside. The package measured approximately 12 inches by 8 inches by 4 inches deep, weighed perhaps 6 pounds, and bore a return address from Midwest Scientific Equipment in Milwaukee, a company that claimed to supply laboratory instruments to universities and research facilities throughout the Great Lakes region. The delivery address was apartment 3B at 472 North Oakley Boulevard, a third-floor unit in a 4-story walk-up that property records showed had been vacant since the previous October, when the registered tenant, a mechanical engineer named Robert Koslow, had supposedly relocated to Denver for work. Walter had delivered 3 previous packages to the same address over the past 2 months, packages that accumulated in the building's narrow first-floor mailroom because no one claimed them, and postal regulations required him to hold them for 30 days before marking them as undeliverable and returning them to sender. Except that when he finally processed the return paperwork, the Milwaukee address never accepted the packages, and they simply disappeared into the postal system's bureaucratic void. Walter climbed the worn wooden stairs to the 3rd floor that afternoon, his boots leaving wet prints on steps that no superintendent had bothered to salt or clear of ice. The building retained the smell of decades of cooking, cigarette smoke, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in structures where landlords spent nothing on maintenance beyond the absolute minimum required by city housing codes. Apartment 3B's door showed no light beneath the frame, no sound emerged from inside, and the doorknob bore a thin layer of dust that suggested no one had entered or exited in days. He knocked firmly 3 times, following postal protocol for signature-required deliveries, waited the regulation 60 seconds, knocked again, and then made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both his life and a major FBI counterintelligence operation. He tried the doorknob. The apartment opened easily, revealing a space that contradicted everything about its supposedly vacant status. Fresh food sat in the refrigerator. Clean dishes filled the drying rack beside the kitchen sink. Technical manuals in Russian covered the small dining table. And in the corner of the living room, positioned beside a window that offered a clear view of the street below, sat a sophisticated radio transmitter whose design Walter immediately recognized from classified equipment briefings he had attended during his final year in occupied Japan, when military intelligence had trained logistics personnel to identify Soviet communication devices in case enemy agents attempted to infiltrate supply chains. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell below. Heavy boots taking the steps two at a time. Someone was coming fast. Walter grabbed the package and moved. He crossed the apartment in 4 strides, yanked open the window facing the fire escape, and dropped 3 stories down the metal ladder with the speed of a man half his age. The footsteps reached the 3rd floor as his boots hit the alley pavement. He didn't look back. The package stayed tucked under his postal jacket as he walked 3 blocks south, merged with afternoon foot traffic, and caught the Ashland Avenue bus that would carry him back toward the central post office, where his shift had officially ended 20 minutes earlier. The weight of what he had discovered settled over Walter during the 40-minute bus ride through Chicago's grid of streets, where late afternoon sun cut sharp shadows between buildings and commuters, filled every available seat with the exhausted silence of people who worked hard for modest wages and expected nothing more from life than a steady paycheck and a quiet retirement. His hands had stopped shaking by the time he reached his stop at Harrison Street, but his mind continued processing the implications of that apartment's contents with the methodical analysis that military logistics training had burned into his thinking patterns decades earlier. The radio transmitter he had glimpsed represented technology that exceeded anything commercially available in the United States, equipment that required both significant technical expertise to operate and access to frequencies that the Federal Communications Commission strictly regulated for government and military use only. The Russian manuals suggested the apartment's occupant possessed language skills beyond what any legitimate mechanical engineer would require for work in Denver or anywhere else in America's industrial heartland. And the fresh food in the refrigerator indicated someone actively used that space despite property records and landlord statements claiming the apartment had remained vacant for 5 months, which meant someone had created a sophisticated cover story that had fooled housing authorities, postal officials, and probably neighbors who lived on the same floor. Walter's investigation into similar delivery anomalies across his route had begun 3 months earlier, when he noticed that 7 different apartments in 5 separate buildings all received packages from the same cluster of supply companies, despite those apartments supposedly housing residents with completely unrelated professions, according to postal registration records. He had started maintaining a personal logbook where he recorded every suspicious delivery, noting the time, address, sender information, package size, and any unusual characteristics like excessive weight for the stated contents or return addresses that seemed inconsistent with the sender's claimed business type. The pattern that emerged suggested a network rather than isolated incidents, with packages arriving in coordinated waves every 2 to 3 weeks and always requiring signature confirmation, even though no one ever answered the door to provide that signature. His supervisor at the Central Post Office, a career bureaucrat named Morton Hibbs, who had spent 32 years processing paperwork and resented anyone who complicated his simple routines with observations that required actual investigation, had dismissed Walter's concerns during their February meeting by suggesting that delayed mail forwarding and clerical errors explained the supposed anomalies and that a mailman's job involved delivering mail rather than playing detective. The deaths had started in January with Thomas Kowalski, a 61-year-old carrier who worked the route immediately west of Walter's territory and who supposedly died from a heart attack while shoveling snow from his driveway despite having passed his annual postal physical examination with no cardiovascular issues just 3 months earlier. February brought the traffic accident that killed Sandra Morrison, a 28-year-old substitute carrier who had mentioned to Walter during their lunch break that she had noticed several packages addressed to a supposedly abandoned warehouse on her route and planned to report the irregularity to postal inspectors who investigated mail fraud. March added Robert Chen to the list, a veteran carrier found dead in his apartment from what police called an accidental carbon monoxide leak, even though Chen was a mechanical engineer before joining the postal service and would have immediately recognized the symptoms of gas poisoning. 3 carriers dead in 3 months from 3 different causes that investigators treated as unrelated coincidences. But Walter's military experience had taught him that coincidences rarely clustered so conveniently around people who all worked for the same organization and all served routes in the same general geographic area of Chicago's North Side. The FBI field office occupied the 7th floor of the Everett McKinley Dirksen Federal Building at 219 South Dearborn Street, a location that required Walter to take 2 buses and walk 4 blocks from the post office while carrying the package he had taken from apartment 3B. He arrived at 4:37 in the afternoon on March 15th and spent 90 minutes in a waiting room filled with uncomfortable wooden chairs and faded posters warning citizens about the dangers of communist infiltration before a junior agent named Dennis Crawford finally agreed to hear his report. Crawford listened to Walter's presentation with the expression of someone enduring an unavoidable waste of time, took minimal notes, and responded to the physical evidence of the package by explaining that FBI counterintelligence operations did not investigate suspicious mail based on the unsupported theories of postal workers who lacked any law enforcement training or security clearance. The agent suggested that Walter return the package through normal postal procedures, forget about the apartment on North Oakley Boulevard, and focus on his actual job responsibilities unless he wanted his supervisor to receive a report about a carrier who had illegally opened mail and trespassed in private property. Walter opened the package that night in his basement workshop using tools that left the exterior wrapping intact enough to reseal. Inside he found components for a shortwave radio receiver, technical specifications printed in English but using metric measurements that American manufacturers never used, and a hollow compartment built into the packaging itself that contained microfilm. He held the film strip up to his workbench light. Tiny photographs showed documents with Cyrillic text, maps of Chicago with specific buildings circled, lists of names beside what looked like surveillance schedules. And in the final frame, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone who had studied military logistics maps during the war, coordinates for locations in southern Florida that matched exactly with newspaper reports about American military buildups following intelligence reports of Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Someone knocked on his front door. 3 sharp raps. Then silence. Then 3 more raps. The pattern Soviet agents used in occupied Berlin to identify each other to contacts. Walter killed the basement lights and reached for the pistol he hadn't touched since 1946. The knocking stopped. Walter heard footsteps moving away from his front door, descending the wooden porch steps, fading into the street noise of evening traffic, and neighbors returning home from work. He stayed frozen in his basement for 11 minutes by his watch, before climbing the stairs and checking the peephole. Empty porch. Empty street, except for normal activity. But taped to his front door was a photograph of his daughter Ellen, standing outside her elementary school in Oak Park, taken that same afternoon based on the winter coat she had worn to school that morning. No note, no threat, just the photograph and the message it conveyed with absolute clarity. The realization that Soviet intelligence had identified him as a threat and moved to immediate action rather than simple surveillance forced Walter to confront capabilities that exceeded anything he had imagined during his months of casual investigation into suspicious mail patterns. Professional intelligence operatives had photographed his daughter, identified his home address, and demonstrated their ability to reach him whenever they chose, all within approximately 30 hours of his entering the apartment on North Oakley Boulevard. The speed of their response suggested either a well-established network with significant resources deployed throughout Chicago, or the presence of a highly placed source within American law enforcement or postal administration who could track Walter's movements and alert Soviet handlers before he even reached the FBI field office with his evidence. The photograph's message was unmistakable in its simplicity and its cruelty, the universal language that intelligence services used when they wanted compliance without the complications that direct violence created, a language that said, "Your family is vulnerable, and we can reach them anytime we want unless you stop asking questions and forget everything you have seen." Walter's military logistics training had taught him that intelligence operations relied on infrastructure, on the mundane systems that moved information and materials across distances without attracting attention from security services that watched for obvious threats but rarely examined routine administrative processes. The packages he had been tracking for 3 months represented one small component of a larger network that required coordination, communication, and a central hub where operatives could collect materials and receive instructions without exposing themselves to surveillance. The Chicago Central Post Office, where Walter had worked for 17 years, processed more than 2 million pieces of mail daily through a massive sorting facility that employed 460 workers across 3 shifts and maintained separate secure rooms for registered mail, international packages, and items requiring special handling. Those secure rooms operated with minimal supervision between 4 and 7 in the morning, when only skeleton crews managed the overnight sorting operations, a 3-hour window when someone with appropriate access credentials could manipulate mail streams, intercept specific packages, and conduct activities that daylight staff would never witness. The employee records that Walter accessed through a sympathetic clerk in the personnel office revealed a pattern that confirmed his worst suspicions about the depth of Soviet infiltration into Chicago's postal infrastructure. 7 workers hired during the past 18 months all shared similar backgrounds that looked perfectly legitimate on paper, but revealed inconsistencies when examined closely, inconsistencies like employment histories, with companies that had ceased operations years before the dates listed on applications, reference letters from supervisors who didn't appear in any personnel directories, and security clearances processed through a regional office in Milwaukee that had suffered a major fire the previous summer that destroyed most of its archived paperwork. 5 of those 7 workers had been assigned to overnight shifts in the secure sorting facility, positions that gave them unsupervised access to mail streams during the exact hours when suspicious packages moved through the system. One of those 5 workers was named Viktor Petrov, a 42-year-old immigrant from Ukraine, who had supposedly fled the Soviet Union in 1956 during the Hungarian uprising, and who now supervised the international mail sorting section between midnight and 8 in the morning 6 days a week. Walter began his surveillance of the Central Post Office's overnight operations on March 17th, parking his 1957 Chevrolet in different locations each night, and watching the loading docks where mail trucks arrived and departed in carefully choreographed sequences that maintained the flow of correspondence that Americans depended on for everything from birthday cards to business contracts. He documented arrival times, photographed workers entering and exiting, and noted vehicles that appeared repeatedly outside the facility during hours when legitimate postal business should have generated minimal traffic. On the 4th night of surveillance, he observed Viktor Petrov leaving the building at 3:47 in the morning, more than 4 hours before his shift officially ended, carrying a leather briefcase that bulged with contents too large for personal items. Petrov walked 6 blocks to a dark green Ford sedan parked on Clinton Street, handed the briefcase through the passenger window to someone Walter couldn't identify in the darkness, received a small package in return, and walked back to the post office to complete his shift as though nothing unusual had occurred. The breakthrough came when Walter realized that the microfilm he had discovered in the package from apartment 3B contained not just intelligence about American military positions, but also a complete schedule of future package deliveries with dates, addresses, and coded descriptions of contents. Cross-referencing that schedule against his own delivery logs revealed that another major package was scheduled to arrive on March 22nd at 11:30 in the morning, addressed to a different vacant apartment but following the same pattern of false sender information and signature-required delivery. The package would contain updated coordinates for Soviet missile installations in Cuba, along with technical specifications for American reconnaissance aircraft that were conducting surveillance flights over the island, information that would allow Soviet anti-aircraft batteries to calculate optimal firing solutions and potentially shoot down U-2 spy planes that represented America's primary intelligence gathering capability in the Caribbean. That package would arrive at the Central Post Office on March 21st and would spend approximately 18 hours in the sorting facility before being loaded onto delivery trucks the next morning. 18 hours when Viktor Petrov would have unsupervised access to intercept it and transfer the contents to Soviet handlers. Walter contacted the FBI again on March 20th. this time going directly to the office of Special Agent Martin Kessler, who had earned national recognition for breaking a Soviet espionage ring in New York 3 years earlier. Kessler listened to the complete presentation, examined the microfilm evidence, reviewed Walter's documentation, and made 2 phone calls to Washington before informing Walter that FBI counterintelligence had been tracking Viktor Petrov for 8 months as part of a larger operation to identify Soviet intelligence networks throughout the Midwest. The Bureau couldn't arrest Petrov without exposing their investigation and losing the opportunity to identify other network members, but they also couldn't allow him to intercept the package containing updated Cuban missile coordinates. Kessler proposed a solution that required Walter to retrieve the package from the sorting facility before Petrov's overnight shift began, replacing it with a duplicate containing false information that would mislead Soviet intelligence about American capabilities while the FBI traced the package's ultimate destination. The plan required Walter to enter the Central Post Office's secure sorting facility at 10 in the evening on March 21st, locate the specific package among approximately 15,000 items processed that evening, replace it with the FBI's prepared duplicate, and exit without triggering alarms or attracting attention from the 17 workers staffed during that shift. He would have exactly 12 minutes between guard rotations, 12 minutes to navigate hallways he had walked for 17 years, but never during evening hours when different security protocols applied and different workers might question a day-shift carrier wandering through restricted areas. Kessler provided Walter with duplicate access credentials that would open the necessary doors and a radio transmitter disguised as a pocket watch that would allow him to communicate with FBI agents positioned outside the building. But the agent made clear that if anything went wrong, the Bureau would deny any knowledge of the operation, and Walter would face federal charges for breaking into a postal facility. Walter entered the building at 9:58 on March 21st through the employee entrance on Harrison Street. The guard barely glanced at his credentials. The hallways looked different at night, longer somehow, shadows deeper where fluorescent lights had burned out and maintenance hadn't replaced them. He found the international sorting section on the 3rd floor, a vast room filled with metal carts loaded with packages waiting for morning distribution. The package he needed sat in cart number 47, exactly where Kessler's source said it would be. He made the switch in 40 seconds, the FBI's duplicate indistinguishable from the original. He turned to leave and saw Viktor Petrov standing in the doorway watching him, a pistol held loosely at his side. Petrov spoke first, his English carrying the flat precision of someone who had learned the language through intensive training rather than natural immersion. He asked Walter to place the package on the floor and step away from the cart, his pistol never wavering from center mass, and explained with almost clinical detachment that killing a postal worker inside the central sorting facility would create complications, but that those complications were preferable to allowing American intelligence to compromise 8 months of operational planning. The gun had a suppressor attached, the kind of equipment that suggested Petrov had prepared for this exact scenario and had the training to execute it efficiently. Walter calculated distances, angles, the 17 seconds it would take for the next guard rotation to bring someone within shouting distance. None of the calculations offered any solution that didn't end with him dead on the floor of a room where his body wouldn't be discovered until the morning shift arrived in 7 hours. The radio transmitter, disguised as a pocket watch, sat in Walter's left jacket pocket, its emergency button requiring only a single press to alert the FBI agents positioned outside the building. Pressing that button would trigger an immediate raid that would save Walter's life, but would also expose the entire counterintelligence operation before the Bureau could identify other network members, potentially allowing dozens of Soviet agents to escape or destroy evidence. Petrov seemed to recognize Walter's hesitation and offered an alternative that demonstrated the sophisticated psychological training that Soviet intelligence provided to its field operatives. He suggested that Walter could walk away, return to his normal life and his daughter's safety, and forget everything he had discovered about the postal network and the Cuban missile coordinates. The Americans would receive their false information, Soviet intelligence would continue operations unchanged, and no one needed to die in a sorting facility at 10 in the evening over secrets that neither man truly understood or controlled. Walter thought about Ellen's photograph taped to his door. He thought about Thomas Kowalski and Sandra Morrison and Robert Chen dying because they had noticed patterns that threatened operational security. He thought about American pilots flying reconnaissance missions over Cuba without knowing that Soviet anti-aircraft batteries possessed updated coordinates that would turn their aircraft into flaming debris scattered across the Caribbean. He pressed the emergency button. Petrov fired twice before FBI agents crashed through 3 separate doors simultaneously, but Walter had already dropped behind a mail cart and the bullets punched through thin metal without finding flesh. The arrest took 11 seconds. Petrov never spoke another word. The interrogation that followed Petrov's arrest lasted 6 weeks in a secure facility outside Chicago, where FBI counterintelligence specialists worked methodically through layers of cover stories and training that had prepared the Soviet agent for exactly this scenario. Petrov was not Ukrainian, was not a refugee from the Hungarian uprising, and his real name was Dmitry Sokolov, a colonel in the GRU who had operated in the United States since 1954 and had built the postal infiltration network from nothing into one of the most successful Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. He had coordinated the deaths of 7 postal workers across 3 states, had transmitted classified information that compromised multiple American intelligence operations, and had provided Moscow with detailed assessments of American nuclear capabilities that influenced Soviet strategic planning at the highest levels. The evidence Walter had collected, combined with materials seized during the FBI raid, allowed prosecutors to build a case that resulted in Sokolov's conviction on 17 counts of espionage in December of 1962. Dmitry Sokolov spent his final years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, where prison officials kept him in administrative segregation away from the general population for security reasons that no one ever fully explained to the other inmates. He developed lung cancer in 1974, probably from the 4 packs of cigarettes he smoked daily, and died on February 9, 1976, at age 56, without ever revealing the identities of his handlers in Moscow or the names of other network members who had escaped arrest. The Soviets never acknowledged his existence, never attempted a prisoner exchange, and never contacted his family in Russia to inform them of his death. Prison records indicate he received no visitors during his 13 years of incarceration, except for his attorney during the first 18 months. Guards reported that he spent most of his time reading history books and playing chess against himself. They buried him in the prison cemetery under his American alias Victor Petrov because federal regulations required some name on the headstone, and his true identity remained classified for national security reasons until documents were finally declassified in 2003. Walter Henderson continued working as a mailman for another 19 years before retiring in 1981 with a full pension and a classified commendation from the FBI that he was never permitted to discuss publicly. Agent Martin Kessler told him years later that the intelligence network they had disrupted included 43 Soviet operatives embedded in postal facilities, transportation companies, and utility services across 7 states, infrastructure that would have provided Moscow with real-time intelligence about American military movements if the Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated to nuclear war. The package Walter intercepted contained coordinates that could have resulted in the deaths of multiple reconnaissance pilots and potentially changed the outcome of the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. He never told his daughter Ellen why he had suddenly insisted on driving her to school every morning for 3 months in the spring of 1962, and she never asked.